So good afternoon. My name is Nick Truckle, and I'm one of the archaeological officers with the Historic Environment Planning team. And we thought it might be helpful just to outline where the archaeology fits with the planning system and what role we as officers play in the process. I'm going to start with a bit of background, so apologies for those that know all about this, but it puts us where we are today with the current planning regime into context, with a look back into how the response to archaeology sensitive development has evolved over the last 40 odd years, really, and led us to the position where we are now. So the years between 1950 and 75 saw enormous expansion in housing, industry and infrastructure. The impact of all this on archaeology provoked widespread concern, leading to the formation of rescue and the publication of many studies on the archaeological implications of development, especially in urban areas, and pressure on government to address both the lack of funding and the organisational capacity to respond. For most of this period, responses relied heavily on voluntary efforts and on tolerant developers allowing access to sites in advance of the commencement of work. Prior to 1981, when the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act came into force, even scheduled monuments had only limited protection from damaging activities. Many sites were destroyed without record, and from what we now know about the density of archaeological sites in the English landscape, an even greater number of unknown ones must have suffered the same fate. Encouraged by a government circular in 72, some local authorities began appointing staff to address these issues, and it was around this time that Surrey became one of the first local authorities to appoint a county archaeologist. Embryonic sites and monuments record, SMRs, were established, but coverage was patchy and funding limited. In 1974, the Department of Environment announced the establishment of archaeological advisory committees led by a national committee to advise on priorities for excavation with a budget of just over £1 million. Following this initiative, the mix of local authorities and units responded to threats to archaeology through annual bids to the rescue archaeology budget for excavations in advance of development. There was never enough money, and funding for post-excavation was almost always squeezed. Although it's now been established that archaeology was a consideration in the planning process, there was no clear basis in policy for the identification and recording of archaeological sites affected by development. The term evaluation had begun to enter the archaeological lexicon, but the concepts of predetermination and phased programs of evaluation to characterize the archaeology and assess their level of impact were not used before the late 1980s. Nor was it easy through the planning process to secure mitigation. Where planning conditions were used, it was mainly to secure unfunded watching briefs. Although a great deal of important archaeology was recorded, only a very small proportion of developments, invariably where archaeology was already known to be an issue, had provision for any investigation other than unfunded watching briefs. This included many major developments, most notably the M25, the largest single infrastructure project in the 1980s, was carried out with very limited archaeological recording. The political will to legislate to deal with this unsatisfactory state of affairs changed in the late 1980s, informed by a number of instances of archaeological destruction. This culminated in the discovery of the Rose Theatre in 1989 on Bankside, where the unexpected rediscovery of the Shakespearean Theatre and its potential destruction by an office development led to the formation of the Save the Rose campaign. The campaign was led by Sir Laurence Olivier and supported by household names such as Ian McKellen, Dame Judi Dench, Peggy Ashcroft and Alan Rickman. An American actor Dustin Hoffman even flew over from the States to add his support for an all-night vigil. The campaign to save the roads soon became a major national and international news story and a costly embarrassment to the government, who had to partly fund the building redesign and excavation works, and led to measures being finally taken to address the problem. The result was Planning Policy Guidance Note 16 on archaeology and planning, almost universally known as PBG 16, which was introduced in November 1990. Existing patchy voluntary and discretionary arrangements for dealing with archaeology via the planning process were now replaced by a mainstream responsibility for all planning authorities. PBG 16 articulated the importance and vulnerability of archaeological evidence, setting out a simple process for assessing the impact of proposed development and securing the preservation or recording of the archaeological remains affected, depending on their significance. Perhaps most significantly for where we are today, responsibility for funding this work fell on the developer in a polluter pays principle. This requirement for developers to fund the cost of evaluation, excavation and post-excavation led to the exercise of choice over the provider and to the subsequent growth of a private sector of archaeological consultants and contractors. For instance, in the past 3 years, over 25 different archaeological contractors have carried out fieldwork within Surrey. In addition, a clear separation was found to be necessary between the organisation requiring the archaeological work to be carried out, the local planning authority advised by a county or district archaeologist, and the organisation that undertook the work on behalf of the developer, the contracting field unit. Developers naturally look to minimise their costs and use a highly controversial process of competitive tendering as a means of doing so. Thus began the splitting of the profession into parallel strands of public, private and curatorial contracting, a structure that persists today, and saw the creation of the role of the planning archaeologist or curatorial archaeologist to provide professional independent advice to local planning authorities outside of a commercial unit. Local authority archaeological service today typically comprise an HER service and one or more dedicated archaeological officers, mainly based in upper tier local authorities, counties or unitary authorities such as Surrey. Archaeology has been an integral part of the planning and development process ever since. Over time, the guidance has evolved into the current government policy and guidance for the historic environment is set out in the National Planning Policy Framework, NPF, which places the emphasis on understanding and conserving the significance of heritage assets as part of sustainable development. This makes the need to consider historic environment constraints, impacts and benefits an imperative from the outset of the development process to avoid unexpected issues at key planning and construction stages. What do we do? The Historic Environment Planning Team was 4 archaeological officers, as Tony mentioned earlier, dedicated to providing archaeological advice to the county council and the district councils that make up Surrey. Each district has a number of policies within their local development plans relating to heritage. And obviously this slide will be supplied later, which shows you who covers which areas. Tony mentioned the local policies. This one's Waverley's Development Management Policy 24 that sets out their policies relating to potentially archaeological sensitive development. As you will see, the policy clearly sets out that there's a requirement for archaeological assessment if the site is near or on a scheduled monument, although this would in practice be deferred to Historic England, county sites of archaeological importance, areas of high archaeological potential, which Tony has covered these, so I won't say any more about them, and sites over 0.4 or 1 acre in old money. These requirements are consistent across the county, and the latter policy, the 0.4 in particular, as Tony said, allows archaeological assessment of land within areas that may or not have been subject to much previous development, and therefore the HER may not contain many entries relating to previous fieldwork or find spots, and therefore wouldn't qualify under the AHAP designations. Proposals for development that fall within any of these identified areas or is over 0.4 automatically trigger a formal consultation with us from the relevant planning authority. These are sent by email to a central email inbox where they are placed on a spreadsheet under the appropriate council area with the site details, application number and date of receipt of the consultation request. We aim to respond to a consultation within 21 days of receipt. Each district has an online searchable website where details of every planning application can be found, and so full details and supporting documents for a specific application, as well as our consultation responses, can be viewed. In 2021, we received and responded to almost 1,000 consultations, excluding historic buildings, which Chris will discuss later, and approximately 350, these 35%, required some type of archaeological response. As well as responding to planning consultations, we also advise on the archaeological implications of work that is outside of the normal planning system, such as utility providers, water pipelines, electricity cable trenches, woodland planting, etc., and provide advice on major infrastructure schemes. We are presently involved with the archaeological work at Gatwick Airport, the Southampton to London fuel pipeline that runs through Surrey, The proposed River Thames flood release scheme and the junction 10A3 Wisley interchange proposals, to mention just a few. We also give pre-planning advice to developers and householders, as well as responding to general archaeological inquiries from the public. On viewing a consultation, if we determine that the development site has the potential to contain archaeology, then we will advise a local authority and the staged process of assessment will begin. So the archaeological process, as it relates to planning, can be split into 4 individual stages. Assessment, looking at the site and surrounding area to ascertain the potential. Evaluation, investigating the site in a small scale and targeted way, causing as little physical disturbance as possible to check for the absence, presence, condition, frequency and significance of any remains that might be present. That followed by mitigation, which would be excavation, recording of any remains on the site, and the removal or rescue of key material for further investigation prior to the site being developed. And the last stage, which is the post-excavation, full specialist analysis of the material, artifacts, publication, and archiving. I'll quickly run through each of these stages. So as you can see from the slide, we have a huge number of different contractors and consultants providing archaeological information to us as competitive tendering has specified. So a desk-based assessment is an assessment of the known potential archaeological resource within a specified area or site. It consists of a collation of existing written and graphic information in order to identify the likely character, extent, quality and worth of the known or potential archaeological resource in a local, regional or national context as appropriate. This will normally be the first stage in determining the archaeological potential of the site and is usually required as supporting information with a planning application that falls within one of the policy criteria areas mentioned earlier. These documents are usually provided by professional heritage contractors and combine information with many sources such as aerial photographs, historic maps, LiDAR, documentary research, but crucially, they must include the results of a consultation with a historic environment record, usually with a 1 kilometre search radius. And Rob will say more about this later on. They provide a reasonable overview of potential and inform the need for any further archaeological investigation, stage 2 in the process. If it's considered the site has archaeological potential, or the potential appears low, but there has been little previous development in the area, so it's better described as uncertain, then further investigation will be required. If no supporting archaeological information on a site which has archaeological potential is provided, then the recommendation from the archaeological officer will be that the planners refuse the planning application. When the assessment has identified the potential for significant archaeological remains, the advice will be that the evaluation should be carried out before a decision is made on the merits of the planning application, which is known as predetermination evaluation. However, if the initial assessment results indicate remains of more local significance may be anticipated, then it is likely that the officer will advise that a condition should be placed on planning consent if granted that requires a programme of investigation following consent but prior to development. And on screen is the standard condition that we use. There are other versions, but this is the one that's used in the majority of the sites in Surrey. So the next stage in the process will be to evaluate the site. So a field evaluation, which is a limited program of non-intrusive or intrusive field work. Non-intrusive investigations such as geophysical survey are sometimes carried out. This is normally magnetometry nowadays, I think because it's a very rapid and cost-effective way of doing it and has pretty useful results in some cases. It's very useful in locating intensive settlement or industrial sites, but as results of geophysics can be varied and it can be dependent on the underlying geology. So trial trenching will still normally be required, even if the applicant has provided a largely negative geophysical survey of the site. Our county standard evaluation percentage is 5% of the site area. Trench size is normally 30 metres by 1.8 metres, and the scope and standards for the work is set out in a written scheme of investigation that is approved by us on behalf of the local authority following submission of the document to them as a first stage in satisfying the archaeological condition. The work needs to be carried out by a professional archaeological organisation with a demonstrable track record of carrying out similar work, and preferably a registered organisation with the Institute for Archaeologists. The work must also conform with the document General Standards for Archaeological Projects in Surrey, which we revised in May 22. The evaluation fieldwork will be monitored by one of the archaeological officers who will inspect the work on site to ensure the work conforms to the agreed written scheme and that appropriate archaeological standards are being followed. Decisions such as extending trenches and further sampling of features can also be made at this stage. Most monitoring is done in person, but as a result of COVID, some monitoring is done remotely using digital technology. Following the completion of the evaluation fieldwork, if the results have been negative and it has been therefore demonstrated that the site has no further archaeological potential, then the submission of a report setting out the results and a deposition of the site archive completes the archaeological requirement, and any planning condition can be discharged at this stage and the development can commence with no archaeological constraint. If, however, in the event that archaeology has been revealed by the evaluation works, then discussions will take place with the archaeological officer, the contractor or their archaeological consultant and the developer regarding the extent and significance of the remains and the level of impact posed by the development, so that an appropriate mitigation scheme can be implemented. On urban sites, we don't have too many in Surrey, but it is sometimes possible to preserve archaeological remains through sensitive foundation design to minimise impact. Historic England provides guidance on the level of impact that may be acceptable, and often a combination of limited excavation and foundation design is used. On larger greenfield sites, it is unusual for the archaeological evidence to spread across the entire development area, so the results of the evaluation can be used to refine the area of archaeological interest. In some cases, the developer will be able to relocate elements of the development with little below ground impacts, such as play areas or areas of green space, to preserve the archaeology. And this is the preferred option in the case that unexpectedly significant archaeology is found to be present. Should preservation in situ not be an option, then preservation by record excavation will be required. There's a definition of excavation on the screen, but I'm not going to go through that in detail. A revised and updated written scheme will be needed to be agreed and provided to the local planning authority that clearly sets out the extent of the excavation area as specified by and agreed with the archaeological officer, and sets out appropriate methodologies to ensure the work is done to the highest professional standards. On larger sites, such as quarries, where large numbers of similar features are present, for instance, multiple field systems, or archaeology is dispersed across the site with no obvious concentrations, then an excavation process called strip map and record may be employed, strip map and sample. This involves the total stripping by machine of all overburden and the mapping and selective sampling of the features then revealed. The level of sampling will be linked to research questions set out in the written scheme and will evolve throughout the life of the project, but there will be minimum requirements set out in the general standards document. And again, for future reference, these are minimum standards for sampling archaeological features for evaluations and mitigation schemes. All of the archaeological mitigation works will again be monitored by the archaeological officer, usually on a weekly basis, and the work will not be considered completed until an agreed sign-off between the archaeological officer and the archaeological contractor has been undertaken. The final type of archaeological fieldwork, which I'm going to discuss, which is sometimes suitable for smaller sites, especially small development sites such as extensions within AHAPs, is a programme of archaeological monitoring or watching brief. A watching brief is a programme of observation investigation conducted during construction groundworks where it's possible archaeological deposits may be disturbed or destroyed. Normally for development impact on small sites or sites that have been previously disturbed. It was, however, for quite a long time or less now, the developer's preferred option. There's no requirement to carry out the archaeology in advance of construction. However, unless the impact is very low, this is not considered appropriate, and we will not allow that recommendation to be taken forward in most cases due to the high degree of risk as any archaeology revealed still requires professional excavation and recording if encountered, which can lead to severe delays to programme and, more importantly, damage or loss to archaeological evidence. Sometimes we encounter small sites where it not be proportionate or reasonable, and as Tony pointed out earlier, it's the requirement of the MPPF to be proportionate or reasonable, to require a paid programme of work. And so with the help of local society members, we request an access condition, which just requires prior notification of these works to be provided so arrangement can be made for someone to visit and look at open foundation trench or a service run to record if any archaeology is present. This is particularly helpful in piecing together information that would otherwise be lost on very small sites where it's not proportionate to require a full programme of archaeological work. Following the completion of site fieldwork, the site archive, consisting of the finds, paper and digital archive, is assessed off-site. This preliminary assessment is part of a staged post-excavation process that aims to direct resources at the most significant elements of the fieldwork. This assessment is then included in a post-excavation assessment and updated project design, which sets out the initial results of the work, reviews the original research aims, and sets out a detailed programme of analysis, which will lead to the publication of the results of the project. This document also sets out the resources, usually in person days, that will be required to complete the work. And once that the archaeological officer is satisfied that this resourcing level is appropriate and has received confirmation that appropriate funding is in place, it is at this stage where we advise the local authority that the archaeological requirement for the site has been satisfied and that any planning conditions can be discharged. The reason we do it at this stage is it can sometimes take a long time, sometimes even years, for a final publication to be produced, and it would not be reasonable to keep the condition on a site for that length of time. It's a requirement of the MPPF that the results of fieldwork are made publicly available. Several options are available, from detailed monographs for larger, more detailed sites, or thematic studies, society journals, and specialist or period journals. Increasing interest is being shown in digital publication, with Historic England particularly keen, as this can ensure a much wider dissemination than traditional forms, and a cynic will say is cheaper. An example of this will be the forthcoming publication of the Guildford Fire Station Paleolithic site, which will be a combination of a limited print run monograph for sale with a PDF version freely downloadable. And finally, you'll be pleased to know, there is a requirement to deposit the site archive so that it can be available for future study, usually with a local accredited museum. Although with the growth of archaeological investigations over the past 30 years, museums and other bodies are increasingly unable to accept archives due to a lack of storage space. An unintended consequence of that initial PBG 16, and perhaps the next great challenge that the heritage profession has in persuading government to address in the future. And that completes my 20 minutes.